recorded so that we can post it online afterwards and provide links to your colleagues. We will open up the lines at the very end of the presentation, and we won't post the conversation we have. A little bit different from our usual approach, but thanks. And in the meantime, you can send questions over the chat box if you like, while you're muted, or any concerns you have. That's one way to let us know that you have a question or comment or an issue. Okay, so let's get right to it. I want to say that in today's presentation, I've indulged my tendency to draw on a whiteboard, so the presentation is a whiteboard themed, and so thank you for indulging me too with that. This is the overview here. We're going to start with the compliance timeline, how that's changed from the proposal to the final. We'll then look at target setting, talk about the baselines and how they were adjusted, talk about the new building block analysis, including the way it was applied to regions and the order in which it was applied. We'll talk about the mass emissions budgets and what they're looking like, how EPA converted from rate to mass, and then also focus on treatment of early action. And here we'll look not just at the Clean Energy Incentive Program, but also I want to make a few remarks about how early action might be seen also in the other time windows, so the window before 2012 and the window between 2012 and 2021. The plan development process will be where we end, and so this is just to get a sense, what is it that a state has to do between now and September of 2016, and then once it files what it files next September, either an extension request or the final plan, assuming it files an extension request, what are the requirements between now and the time it files the final plan. So we'll focus a bit on that. Turning first to the timeline and targets, and beginning with the key takeaways. The timeline for reductions has been relaxed. We'll talk about that in a second. It's starting later, and the ramp up is more gradual. There is a new building block approach, and there are now 3 building blocks, and they are applied somewhat differently and than they were under the proposal. We'll talk about that. We now have 2 nationwide subcategory specific rates that we're working with, and this is the first thing that EPA derived in setting the emission limitations. We still have the alternative single rates by state, and we have the mass-based alternative. So you can think of it as you have the subcategory specific rates, and then you have 2 other options: the single rates, like we had under the proposal, and the mass budgets, similar to the way they were offered as an option under the proposal. It does seem, by all initial accounts this month, that the mass budgets are more generous than they are under the proposal, and that they also appear easier in terms of the lift than the rates, and at least in percentage terms on paper. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And then one other key thing for a group like this one that is interested in making trading easier across states, there is less disparity in targets across states, which intuitively suggests that we will see more states that are more inclined to trade with each other, because there are huge differences. All right. So compliance timeline. I want to credit the Duke folks, and specifically David Hoppick at Duke Nicholas Institute, for the graphic. I've altered it, so the stuff that's right on here, he gets credit for. If there's anything wrong with it, I accept the blame. So you see here, the final rule came out in 2015, and we have the emissions schedule up here, but it's, we're going to get more into that at the very end here today. What I want to point you to now is the 2-year delay. So under the proposal, it was to start January 1st, 2020. Now it's starting January 1st, 2022. So two-year delay. And there are interim steps that EPA has laid out. They're somewhat advisory. The interim goal is it ramps in a more gradual fashion and leads us to the 2030 goal. Noting here, and we'll return to this when we focus on clean early action in a second, the Clean Energy Incentive Program applies during just that 2-year window, 2020 and 2021, and in part it seems to make up for the fact, or to try to make up for the fact, that the program is delayed a couple of years. So target setting. So the baseline is our jumping off point. So what has changed about the baseline? EPA heard a bunch of comments on what was wrong with the proposed baseline year, 2012, and it made these 3 general categories of adjustments based on what it heard. The first was that 2012 was an anomalous hydropower year for a lot of states. There was more hydropower than normal. And so the concern on the part of those who commented was that the base year, the 2012 year, did not adequately reflect fossil emissions. And so EPA made an adjustment for states that rely heavily on hydro, more than 10% or more of their mix, and that saw a greater than 5% increase in hydro generation that year. They received a hydropower adjustment. In the upper Midwest, that affected South Dakota, and if you count Montana's in MISO as well, Montana also got a hydropower adjustment. There was one adjustment for an outage, and that was Xcel's Sherco plant, which we all know well in this group. Xcel and Minnesota successfully argued to have that adjustment made to their baseline to reflect the big unit at the Sherco plant. And then the third type of adjustment that was made, and this affected many more states than the hydro and the outage adjustment, was that EPA included under construction plants in the baseline, and the way they calculated that was to assume that those under construction coal would operate at a 60% capacity factor and natural gas at a 55% capacity factor. And that affected those states that had listed there in parentheses. More than just these, but these are the ones in the upper Midwest. Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, North Dakota, and South Dakota all had under construction adjustments made to their baselines. So the jumping off point is different for a number of states, and for one of our main states here, Minnesota, there was a big correction that was made to address the Sherco outage. So there are 3 building blocks here instead of 4. Last time there was an energy efficiency building block. That one's no longer here. The heat rate improvements is building block number 1. It is where existing coal plants improve their heat rates. In this iteration, in the finalized version, EPA does not take into account capital improvements. So they look just at historically demonstrated improvements through operation and maintenance at these plants. The second building block is natural gas, and they made a change here as well. Instead of looking at nameplate capacity, they looked at summer capacity, and essentially summer capacity is less than nameplate capacity. I'm sure one of you would be better to explain the difference, but suffice it to say that commenters felt EPA was over-assessing the ability of new natural gas plants to ramp up, and it was suggested that they use peak summer capacity. They did. And then the third thing is on the renewables building block. Here they focused only on incremental post-2012 renewable capacity, and they based the potential on historical trends and new cost information. So in each of these 3, there are tweaks in the way that EPA thought of each building block, and there are 3 now, and energy efficiency has fallen by the wayside. Energy efficiency, even though it wasn't used to calculate the goal, will still be available as one of the potential areas where activities that can be credited if the state takes a rate-based approach. And of course, on a mass-based side, energy efficiency does show up in the form of avoided emissions at existing plants. So what happened then? So EPA calculated the actual emissions rates in each of the 3 regions. So this is a big change. Instead of applying these building blocks on a state-by-state basis, they applied them on a regional basis. And you see the 3 regions here. So they started with the actual emissions rate from fossil steam and from NGCCs in each region. They then applied the building blocks in the order shown here. Very important that the order was shifted, and we actually had conversations in the collaborative at some point about how the order of application really did matter. EPA apparently realized that as well. They started with the heat rate improvements, which affected the amount of emissions attributable to coal plants nationwide and in each region. They then applied renewable energy component, and in doing so, they backed off generation from both fossil steam and NGCC plants. What this did is it then created more space for the second building block when it was applied in the third step. So the third step was natural gas ramping up to 75% of summer capacity over time, and because renewables had already backed them off, at least in the way this was calculated, there was more room to do that. So that's it's important the way they ordered that there. And then after applying the three building blocks, they looked at the three regions and determined which was the least stringent for each year in the compliance horizon. And the Eastern Interconnect one, as you can see, was the winner. They were the ones that set the fossil steam and the NGCC subcategory rates. All right, so first thing I want to show here, and I'm not getting into great detail on the rate calculations and everything. The main point here, I think, is unlike the proposal, the rates are what they are, and EPA is not taking comment on changing them. So it's important that we understand how they came to be, and then think about that, because it does sort of help you think about a way that a state or a region might comply. What you can see here is that across this upper Midwest stretch of states, these are all MISO states, in the upper MISO, left off Montana in the upper left, and the states in the lower part. But here you can see, as you look at the different rates, the 2030 rate being the one not in parentheses and the interim rate in parentheses below it, there is much less daylight between the states. So, we had many conversations as a group talking about how it might be difficult to get a state with a very, very high rate to trade with a state that had a very, very low rate. That was an impression that a lot of folks had. As you can see here now, they're much more closer together, and so one might, using that same intuition, suggest that perhaps trading among these states is going to be more viable option, or in their eyes. So EPA took the rates and they converted them to mass targets, and they did that for all the existing units, and then they did it for what they called new source complements. So they said, well, if the state was going to include new sources, how many additional tons would that give them? So in that, by all accounts so far that I've heard talking about the rule, EPA was much more generous in the way that they created the mass budgets relative to rate, and that's reflected here to some degree in this map, showing the differences. So this is a very simple analysis. We shouldn't overstate what this means. It's sort of a gut level impression. If you look at the percent change from baseline rate to 2030 rate, these are the numbers you get for each state. And then when you compare that to the baseline emissions and the 2030 emissions, you see that the relative changes are quite different for different states. I want to note here that for Minnesota, I adjusted the baseline to incorporate Sherco, and so that that makes it different. If I had left Sherco out, then mass looked way even better. But when you adjust for that Sherco, it's closer together, 42 and 34. And for South Dakota, their there are baseline adjustments as well. I mentioned there's one for hydro that is not factored into here, but it could be, and I suspect what we would see is that they wouldn't have a growth target with mass once you took into account the assumption that they would have had more fossil online. All right, so again, I don't want to overstate this. We have to check this, right? We have to do actual modeling and see whether these on paper differentials and percentages are one thing. You have to model the rate versus mass and see, well, hey, is that reflected in the costs? EPA in its analysis did show that if states nationwide took a mass-based approach, they would save $3.3 billion in 2030. But they were looking at states taking the single rate approaches versus states taking the mass-based approach. They did not model the subcategory rate approach. And we need to do that to sort of test some of these propositions. All right. I want to focus a little bit on treatment of early action, and there are a number of ways to think about this. And this has been a topic of great discussion among the collaborative group. And there have been those who have voiced under the proposal the sense that the proposal did not adequately give credit to states that had sort of shifted over time to bring on more renewables and invest in energy efficiency and otherwise sort of diversify their power mix and make it less carbon intensive. The one thing I think we have a sense of now, these few weeks after the rule came out, was that states that had transitioned somewhat away from a carbon-intensive power sector and toward one that was less carbon-intensive actually have less to do under the final rule. And so in a sense, we might think of that as an acknowledgement of pre-2012 action. I think that's probably what EPA would say. And then we've talked about the other two periods of time. So what about that period after the base year and before the program launches? Do we get credit, or is there an incentive to do anything in that time period? Does it help a state achieve its goal? And I think here we have to think about mass-based versus rate-based. And under a mass-based approach, we can say that anything that reduces the annual emissions from the baseline count. Whatever that is, including pre-2012 renewables, if that is in your state and you may not be getting credit for that generation under a rate-based approach, if it is displacing fossil emissions and making you less reliant on the fossil plants, then in a sense you're getting early action credit for that. And then under a rate-based approach, you do get credit for incremental RE, renewable energy that is installed post-2012 for the generation that it puts out in the time period after the program compliance period starts in 2022. So while the generation between now and then isn't credited, the capacity does earn credit once the compliance starts. And I suppose that may leave states feeling like, well, do I need to rush to get that renewable energy in the ground, or can I wait just as long as it's up and running in time to get credit after 2022? That's all that concerns me. I think that is still there, that potential disincentive to move quickly to install renewable energy that we've discussed quite frequently in this group. So then in 2020 and 2021, the Clean Energy Incentive Program kicks in. And I mentioned a couple weeks ago when we had talked about first impressions of the rule that this looked really familiar. And it does. It's almost the early action credit approach that this group talked about, almost agreed to in its comments to EPA, and reflects perhaps the new role of one of our members, not to name any names. But the Clean Energy Incentive Program awards mass-based tons or rate-based emission reduction credits to low-income energy efficiency projects and certain renewables projects that are installed after the submission of the state plan. So if the state gets it in early, then that increases the window that this capacity can be installed and count. But otherwise, after September 8, 2018, which of course is the date by which all state plans have to be in. So, we don't know to what extent this is going to drive projects to be installed and additional work to be done, but we do know that anything that is installed during that window can earn emission reduction credits, early ERCs, you might call them, Clean Energy Incentive Program ERCs, and the state has to opt into this program, and it's optional. They don't have to do it, but they then would have to administer it. So take applications from projects and deem them worthy or unworthy for the allowances and or credits that are awardable under the Clean Energy Incentive Program. So those are the three sort of windows and some thinking out loud ways that we might think about early action, whether or not it's credited. I mean, maybe not credited in exactly the same way that some of us have thought about it, but in a sense. All right, so that was the target setting. That was the compliance period. That was early reduction or early action and thinking about the mass-based budgets that states get. Now I want to turn to policy pathways. And this is essentially, how does the state decide what approach to take in its state plan, given all of the options? So first, key takeaways from this section. We can also say here that mass-based trading pathways are an easier lift. And here I'm not talking about stringency, I'm talking about the steps the state has to make and the infrastructure it has to build to implement a mass-based program versus a rate-based program. And this is not news to any of us. But now we have, with the final rule, some more tangible aspects to point to. I'm going to go through some of those here. The EPA did embrace the trading ready approaches, and I'm really proud and feel privileged to have worked with this group that developed in many ways the core concepts of trading ready that EPA embraced in the final rule. And in some ways, you look at the two model rules, and those model rules could have been the two main sections of our white paper that we've been working on. With the mass-based trading ready and the rate-based trading ready. In some ways, they stole our thunder there, but they answered the request. So, going into the final model rule, we weren't sure whether rate-based trading ready was going to be an option, and we know now that there's a new rate-based trading ready option that doesn't require states to merge their goals, and at least in theory doesn't require a whole lot of coordination between states that adopt this option. They can decide to trade if they adopt that subcategory rates trading ready option. So that's a big one, and a big one for this group considering the contribution it made. Another big key takeaway is that new units are excluded from a rate-based approach. So in thinking about rate or mass, that was, I think, part of a lot of us thinking when we were thinking about rate-based approaches, we were thinking about how gas would play in. This is a significant change from the proposal. On the mass-based side, EPA is encouraging new units to be included. On the rate-based excluded, mass-based, they're encouraging new units to be included. And I think that's because they need to address the fact that emissions could leak to new units. And that's essentially the approach they took. They're offering new source complements, so additional funds in the budget amounts to about a 1% less reduction thereabouts for most states. But there's a new source complement that adds to the state's emissions budget, and the state has to either take that complement and cover new units, or must address leakage a different way. So that's an interesting and different thing about the final versus the draft or the proposal. And then lastly, just as a key takeaway, we had in our minds, and we've discussed many times as a group, this idea that on the rate-based side, there's a need to process ERCs, emission reduction credits, the new name for rate-based credit, ERCs. And EPA is in the final rule given us a much better sense of what it expects in terms of the process and infrastructure that would be needed to process ERCs. And they've also provided a liability rule. And I'm going to focus on these things in part because I think it may help states make and stakeholders decide which approach they prefer. It is the big ticket item on the rate-based side. Okay. So what has changed about how states can make this decision about a state plan approach? In many ways, there are still lots of options, and so states can't really look at the final rule and say, I really have no choices. I'll just do it. I guess I'll be implementing what they served up. Instead, there's still lots of options. States are in many ways starting with a blank page. Their objectives and goals, I think, are pretty well defined in the discussion leading up to the final, and so it's probably not a whole lot of need to reevaluate those, which leads us to the threshold question, things like rate or mass. Have those considerations changed? And I think when we think about those threshold questions against the final rule, they have indeed changed, and in some ways, you might say the threshold questions seem easier to answer than they were beforehand, and at least the options are clearer, and states can pick a path. Mm-hmm. And so after the threshold questions, we will talk a little bit here about what are the policy pathway options. So we'll go through these. Rate or mass, trading question, do I allow it as a state or not? Who are my regulated entities? How has that changed? Do I allow interstate trading ready? How would that play out? Is it a yes or no question, or is it a yes, I'll trade with X, Y, and Z, but not ABC states? And then what happens to new units? And we've already previewed this a little bit. There are some significant changes. On rate versus mass, though, I think we can say a lot of the stuff that we laid out together and the various resources that were made, including this one that we did in connection with the paper that we put out earlier in the year, the comparisons are still valid. They're just things that need to be tweaked about them. So when we ask the question, how has rate versus mass, how has that comparison changed? Here are the top 4 bullets that I came up with on each side. So on the rate-based side, there's, of course, this new rate-based trading ready option. And a lot of us, in assessing rate versus mass before, we were thinking it's going to be hard to trade with rate. You had to merge your goals, and it was a hard thing to fathom, really. Well, in addition to the rates coming much closer together, maybe to the point where states might even consider merging their goals if they didn't mind coordinating. You don't have to do it under the final. You have this new rate-based trading option. We also have a better sense, as I mentioned, of what the credits desk would look like. You know, that fictional guy or woman at the environmental agency who's taking applications for emission reduction credits and processing them. We have a better sense of how that'll go. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But it gives us, we can visualize more what the rate-based trading option might look like and how it might play out on a practical level. We now know the new NGC plant, CC plants can't earn credit on the rate-based side. And just to note here that we still have that single rate approach available. It still presents some obstacles to interstate trading, but if a state decides that they don't care about interstate trading, then that's still an option. And it may turn out after we really analyze and think through the new rate-based trading ready option that old option commends itself to a state or two. Who knows? On the mass-based side, the budgets are there, and the new source complements are there, and we now, I think, in a reverse from where the proposal was, where some states would look at those budgets and say to themselves, it seems like I get penalized when I go from rate to mass. It's supposed to be equivalent, but it's not. By most accounts, as I mentioned, the budgets seem to be generous, all other things being equal. Now, of course, some states' targets got worse, and so their budgets went down too. But given a particular state target, there's more tons that come with it on the mass-based side than under the proposal. Under the mass-based side, we know we have this new hoop we have to jump through. I mean, if you cover new NGCC units, which is something maybe this is attractive to this group, after having discussions, you'll recall there was a sense that maybe states should cover new NGCCs for competitiveness reasons. But if a state doesn't do that, there are these other hoops, including coming up with a way to address leakage. And EPA has offered allocation methods as the fix, specifically a renewable energy set-aside and a output-based updating allocation set-aside. But if they could think of other ways to try to prevent the advantaging new units over existing if they choose not to cover them in the program. I mentioned that EPA says costs are significantly lower under mass, but we need to test this. Well, let's wait and see. That was a nationwide analysis, and they also were comparing single rate implementation to the mass budget approach. They weren't looking at the subcategory. And I've been told that, from folks who understand modeling a lot better than I do, that it could make a difference. So we'll have to wait and see. All right. So that's the rate to mass comparison. I spent a lot of time on this one because this is really still the big one. The other threshold questions seem smaller now than they did under the proposal, including who to regulate. Remember, under the proposal, we had notions in the proposal of regulating other entities, not just the owners and operators of power plants, and that somehow that regulation was going to be federally enforceable. Well, EPA has backed off that, and there is no longer any approach that applies federally enforceable measures on other than owners and operators of power plants. And really, you can boil down who to regulate to just these two options. And I think for most states, it's going to point to emission standards. And the reason, if you look here under the state measure side, it's mass-based only. Essentially, a state needs to package a set of state measures to achieve the state mass-based goal. And although they're not federally enforceable, they have to be state enforceable. So, for example, if you have a renewable standard that is not technically enforced, maybe there's an alternative compliance statement or something that might seem like it's less of a mandate, then there's still some question about whether that would actually work. It would be considered state enforceable. But the state has to line up all these state measures and say, all right, this is going to get us to the goal. And in the first instance, it would rely on those state measures to achieve the goal. But if it doesn't, or if it falls off by a certain percentage, 10%, then a federally enforceable backstop kicks in, which the state has to pick as well. So the states have two programs to develop. I don't want to overstate that because the state could pick one of the model rules to be their backstop. But still, under each of the model rules, there are lots of choices to make for a state, and it's not just a plug-and-play kind of thing. So in many ways, the state measures approach is an accommodation for California that believes it has state measures that'll get it there. And so for California, it's just about figuring out what the backstop is. And maybe that's also true for the RGGI states. Those are the two examples that EPA seems to have been focused on with state measures. But if other states are sort of starting from scratch and they don't have a bunch of state measures they're prepared to package together and don't want to have to at the same time think about a federally enforceable backstop, well then they're really just looking at an emission standards approach. And that's an approach very similar to the way a traditional Clean Air Act program has been played out. So this is very familiar territory to folks. So this question of who to regulate, not such a big deal under the final. Certainly not anywhere near as hard to decide as under the proposal. Questions on trading. Do I allow trading as a state? Do I allow interstate trading? There was a trend, including among this group. This group really sort of honed in and was focused on how do we enable states to opt into trading, make plans that are trading ready, and to do it in a way that's as least hassle as possible. this will all resonate with you. EPA's really answered the call to make trading easier. They've provided 2 model rules that, when they're finalized, will be considered presumptively approvable, and they're due to be finalized next summer. And allowing interstate trading, the question of being trading ready. So here it is. In some ways, we don't know as we sit here right now whether it makes sense for a state to trade. We have a sense that it does make sense, that bigger markets lead to greater efficiencies. And we've seen some analyses that point to that by the ISOs, MISO and PJM, and most recently SBP, showing that trading across states makes sense economically and perhaps also reliability-wise. PJM focused on that in their analysis more so than the other 2. But the question of interstate trading ready, at the notion that this group worked so hard on and that EPA embraced, it seems like it's almost there, served right up for states to choose. And then once they do their analyses and eyeball things out, they decide whether to switch trading on or not. So this is a threshold question, yes, but the threshold question is, do I make my plan trading ready? The other question of, do I switch the trading on? That's something states can do later, and when they do, they can decide whether they just switch it on for everybody or if they switch it on for a subset of states. So a lot of flexibility there. Takes a lot of the oomph out of this, I think, a lot of the intimidation factor out of it for states, especially since they can delay the decision on trading until later. So how to handle new units. This was a big one under the proposal, and in some ways on the mass-based side, it is still a big one. On the rate-based side, out of our hands. If a state goes rate-based, new units aren't covered, and so no decision to make there. That's a lot easier. On the mass-based side, the state can take the new source complement and have a slightly larger budget and cover new units. And if they don't do that, then a state has to come up with a potential leakage solution. The one option that EPA floats are 2 set-asides, renewable energy set-aside and a updating output-based allocation set-aside. We talked about that a little bit on the last call. And these are the kinds of issues that we may want to focus on as a group to sort of figure out together, the way we figured out lots of other issues together. So that's the approach. The threshold questions are a lot easier. They're not answered for us, and rate versus mass is still, well, in some cases they're answered for us, but for the most part they're not answered for us, but they're made more cut and dry with the possible exception of rate versus mass, which still stands out as the key threshold question when choosing a policy pathway. So here's EPA's map of the state plan approaches. This is a slide that Andy pointed out on our last call. And thank you, Andy, for doing that. It's a really interesting slide. I don't have the whole slide up there, but in EPA's presentation, there's a bunch of text around this thing. And the text really amplifies what we're seeing from a graphical standpoint. So here's a visual that really speaks volumes. If you just sort of blur out the words, you might think, hey, the stuff at the top is more straightforward than the stuff at the bottom. Or that's the message EPA is trying to tell us. And the way I look at these white boxes, they're like hoops. Hoops that a state has to jump through. And in some cases, compliance entities would have to jump through to make a particular approach work. And the one at the top, EPA, essentially is saying, trading ready, mass-based, where you're covering the new unit, not much to jump through, folks. You're there. The next one down is the model rule that they provide, and it's a model rule because it's also a possible federal plan, and EPA didn't choose the top one as the model rule because it does not perceive itself as having the legal authority to cover new units. So the model rule or the federal plan will not cover. If there's a federal plan, mass-based in a state, it will only cover existing units, and there'll be a leakage remedy rather than covering new sources. Okay, so this is a visual, mass versus rate. The white blocks are hoops you have to jump through. We get a sense that that mass is going to be easier. These are things we knew already from our discussion, but now we have a better sense of what those hoops entail. And so if there's a reason we want to do rate-based, really we know what we're getting ourselves into. We know better how to meet the challenges of rate-based trading, if that's what we want to do. And so I'll just call out the other model rule here is the new rate-based model trading rule, and it's the top line in the rate. What you could do here, if you're trying to rule things out, or if your states are toying with the idea of ruling things out, you're not going to do state measures approach because you just want to do one program and have it apply to owners and operators. Then you could draw a line through the state measures line, which leaves you with two mass-based options. And then down below, if you're pretty sure you want trading, interstate trading, and you don't want to have to negotiate with the other states to merge your both together and do the other things that you have to do for a multi-state plan, then you could cross out the middle one at the bottom. And then at the bottom, it's the notion that we've talked a little bit about, that if you don't like the rates that EPA has served up for your rate-based plan, you can vary the rates. You can differentiate them in a different way. And it just means you have to do an additional projection. You have a new hoop to jump through to show that you'll meet the goal, and you probably also can't trade other than intrastate trading. So the bottom two are more oriented toward intrastate trading, not cross-border trading. And so if you're a state that wants to keep that option open and you go rate-based, you're probably going to choose the top one. So it's a really busy chart, and I looked at it and I thought, maybe it's too much to put up here, but visually it really speaks volumes on the way EPA thinks about these different approaches. And so, and Andy suggested it, so I did it this way. So boiling it down, if a state is sort of set on trading ready options, these are the three. And the reason there are two under mass is, of course, again, then if the state wants to have new units covered or not. And I want to just emphasize that we've talked about this a lot in the group, and maybe it's worth more talking as we go forward, but the choice about whether to cover new units doesn't matter to EPA, right? So you can satisfy your federal requirements either with this top one or the bottom mass-based trading ready option, but it might matter to other states. And so when we're talking about trading ready and we're thinking about just the opportunities that may come with trading across a lot of states, we always have to ask ourselves, when there's something different about what we did compared to others, is that going to be an obstacle to trading? Not that it will. We just have to ask the question and consider that it might, and then then probably talking occurs to make sure that the states that you want to trade with don't care that you didn't cover new units if that's what you plan to do. So what is there about the mass-based trading ready approach that we really need to understand better? I think the good news for the group is that mass-based trading ready option isn't that different from what we had talked about and what I think we had in mind as we were making those recommendations as a group to EPA in the spring. A few things just to point out. There's this question of including new plants or not. That was already an issue for us. We know now that EPA sort of focused in on it in a way that we didn't know before. It's a question of leakage and competitiveness, and maybe the group needs to talk about, well, should states keep new plants in, or what do they do if they don't include them to sort of fix the competitiveness and leakage concerns. The other thing that sort of things that jump out that might require more discussion beyond where we were ahead of time with our mass-based trading ready thinking is allowance distribution. We talked about that a little bit on the last call. And then the question, who to trade with. So, I just mentioned that. We have to sort of stop and maybe think, what are states going to care about here with on the mass-based side? And we've talked about how we don't think allowance distribution is going to make them care. We could talk a little bit more about that, and we can also just focus on this new plants question. Is it going to matter if the states include new or don't include new for purposes of making themselves attractive in the eyes of other trading partners. And then lastly, the tracking system. This group asked EPA to provide one as an option to states. They say they will. They'll make the tracking system available. And they also make a new system an option, so states can build out their own regional system or state system if they like. So those are sort of the things that jumped out at me. Maybe you have others. But in general, I'd say what we were thinking about for mass-based trading ready is pretty much what you get in the final rule. On the rate-based side, we probably have more work and discussion and thinking and analysis to do, and because it's a new idea. And under the rate-based trading ready approach, each plant has to achieve the rate that's assigned to its subcategory. So NGCCs have to meet the NGCC rate. Fossil steam have to meet the fossil steam rate, and they do that for the most part in both cases by adjusting their rates with ERCs. There are two kinds of ERCs. One can be used by gas plants, and those are the regular ones. And those are similar to the rate-based credits we've been talking about leading up to the final. And the fossil steam units can use regular or gas shift ERCs, which are specific separate commodities that gas plants earn when they utilize what was previously underutilized natural gas capacity. So there's been no modeling of this yet that I'm aware of. EPA didn't model it. They modeled the single state rate-based approach and compared that to the mass, but they didn't do this one yet. So we'll have to wait and see how this sort of pans out in the analyses. And then the big question is, how are ERCs created? And just like as we had talked before with the single rate trading approach, regular ERCs can be created by a plant if that plant is operating at better than the prescribed rate. I showed you the map of the rates, and the interim rates in the first couple of years are such that natural gas plants will be generating credits, probably. But by the time we're done and we get to 2030, many fewer of those natural gas plants, if any, will be still generating emission reduction credits of the regular sort. They generated because their emissions rate are better than the prescribed rate. And then the other big one is creditable activities. And under the federal model rule that EPA is proposing to apply in the case of a federal plan in a mass-based state, renewables and nuclear would be creditable. And then if a state adopted the model rule, they can add to that demand-side energy efficiency, CHP, T&D, and presumably other things. And then there's the gas shift ERCs, and they are earned only by existing NGCCs that increase their utilization beyond the rates in the baseline. So, and then just noted again that new NGC plants cannot earn credits. That's important to keep in mind. I think a lot of folks, having thought very much about the proposal, still have that in their heads, and that's sort of a starting point. New plants can earn credits. So a look at, I said earlier that we have a better sense of what the ERC process is, and we do. EPA's laid it out, and it's essentially a two-step process, and it looks a lot like offsets. If you're a company that does business in California where they have an offset component to their mass-based trading program, this is very similar to that. The requirements are different. So step one is an eligibility application, and that's where I have a project. It's a renewables project, or it's an energy efficiency project, or it's a nuclear uprate, and I file an eligibility application with the ERC desk, this sort of mythical now entity within the environmental agency that is manned and womaned by folks who receive these applications and process them. And we know that the eligibility application has to have certain things in it, and one thing is third-party verification. So that can be seen two ways. It's good from the state's perspective because the processing perspective, because they have a third-party verification they can rely on. It's another step that the applicant has to take, but it probably increases the likelihood that only only eligible applications are going to be submitted to the IRC test, and most of them will probably be deemed eligible. So the end of step one is for the IRC test to say, okay, your project is eligible. And then the project proponent goes off and does the project, and which leads us to step two. And the credits apply and can be issued only after the fact, so after the generation and savings have been demonstrated to EPA. I'm sorry, to the states, and to EPA if EPA is the one implementing this in your state. And again, with the credit application, there has to be a third-party verification on there that says, hey, I've reviewed this, and I think it's worthy of the credits that they're seeking here in step two. Goes back to the IRC test. IRC test reviews it, issues the IRCs. One important thing about this process is, what happens next once the IRCs are issued? How are disputes handled? So what if there's somebody on the outside that's watching this and they say, that's crap, I don't think those IRCs should have been issued, and they want to challenge it? Under the federal circumstance, EPA has said, well, they'll use 40 CFR Part 78, which is the federal administrative appeals process for this purpose. You can look it up. It lays out all the steps. We can do that for you to help you better understand what it would entail on the federal level. On the state level, they could create a similar administrative process, or using an existing one that exists for other environmental agency decisions. And then, once the idea of having that kind of process is that it hopefully leads to resolution of issues before a lawsuit has to be filed. But a lawsuit could be filed even after that, challenging the final determination of the agency after the appeal. Which sort of makes us ask the question, well, if I'm a owner and operator of a plant and I want to buy IRCs to use them, I need them to adjust my rates. What is that? Do I have to worry about? And they're being bad down the line. And the answer is yes, you do. There is the liability for the improperly issued IRC will lie ultimately with the affected unit that uses it for compliance. So there needs to be that would be taken into account by buyers of credits. They would assess the credit. They would think, what is their potential liability? In some cases, probably fairly straightforward, like renewable generation and nuclear uprates, those sorts of things, fairly straightforward, it would seem, at least in comparison to perhaps some other things like energy efficiency credits. And maybe things like T&D credits, where transmission and distribution credits that are less not as easy to get your head around, at least not initially. Perhaps over time there would be a track record that would allow those who use the credits to rely on them more fully. So just brainstorming to myself, thinking about, well, what are the IRC infrastructure and staffing needs? It's the credit test to process applications. It's the EM and Z protocols that are yet to develop. So it's important to look at the model rule and see what's in there and what isn't in there. And there is a mechanism. There's a suggested way to handle administrative appeals. There's a liability rule. There's stuff on third-party verifiers. And EPA talks about the tracking systems that they think ought to be built, need to be built. But the protocols behind a lot of the crediting have yet to be developed. In particular, energy efficiency. That's things like if your project is changing out lighting in a large building, then what protocols do you follow to set the baseline for the project and to assess the energy savings, assess and measure the energy and verify it going forward. Those are all very specific when it comes to different types of projects, and so that's what a protocol is, and those would still have to be developed. The third-party verifier accreditation and disciplinary process, something a state would have to have. EPA's thinking about such a thing, and so it might be able to be adopted that way. There might be a third party that steps up to be like the accreditation body, which would help states. And then on tracking, EPA has talked about a sort of a two-track tracking system. It's actually pretty elegant the way they've thought about it. On the one hand, think about the stuff that goes into the process leading up to the issuance of IRCs. All of that stuff would go into an application tracking system. And then once the ERC was issued, the ERC would go into the emissions and generation and ERC tracking system, which would be very similar to the kind of system EPA already has. They would add generation to the mix. And then on the ERC application tracking system, that's basically to make sure that it's transparent. When somebody applies for credit, we all can look at it and say, all right, they've applied for credits for this project. And it would be easier to make sure that there's no double counting. And then to sort of track that application through the system. Once it gets deemed eligible, you have an eligible project that's going to be producing some credits over time, assuming it pans out. And then later, you could see the track record of the project because they would keep coming in to get credits. And the credits would then go into the other registry. But so you'd have this application tracking system that EPA is thinking about having developed. And if they do a federal system, they'll have to have this developed. But one question mark is, will they do this federal system? Because they've talked about the federal plan as something they would probably make either mass or rate, but they won't make that decision until they have to do a federal plan. So there's a little bit of uncertainty about what infrastructure EPA is going to build for states to use on this side of things. They seem amenable to the notion of providing infrastructure for states, but I think it's worth asking them and pressing them on this question for any state that wants to go the rate-based stuff, because you're going to want to know how much is EPA going to do, and then how much is left for you to do. All right, so that brings us to, that's as far as I'm going into the relative approaches. I do think we need to figure out how the gas shift ERTs work, how that plays out in terms of incentives in the marketplace. And we'll have some modeling we'll need to do some modeling or see other people's modeling to figure out, how that would play out and what impact it is on cost and generation, and what does it do to competitiveness between different types of units. But not for this overview presentation. That might be something that we focus on in the near term as a group. It does bring me to the last part of the presentation, which is the state plan process. The question is, what do states have to do in order to get to the finish line here on the 111D process? A number of things in context of the whole rule suggest that EPA really expects most states that need the extension. For example, they're finalizing the federal model rules next summer. And if a state's going to use those, at least in theory, the state would probably need to have them before they started their process of implementing, right, the rulemaking process in the state. So, things like that, and the fact that they pretty much suggest that they expect a lot of extension applications based on the comments they got, suggest that, there's going to be a lot of states, if not most, perhaps all, who ask for an extension, the 2-year extension. And so this September 26th initial submission is most likely going to be a request for an extension, not a final plan. It will be interesting to see if any states try to do a final plan in the 1 year that we have. And then, assuming you did request the extension, you have to file a 2017 update. And by the way, the reason I'm going through this is it really we need to have this sort of in the backdrop as we think about what the group does going forward, because the group's stated intent is to help states make decisions, help them with their state plan process. And so we need to know, well, what are the milestones in that process and what are the requirements that states have to meet so that we can then think about how to interface with those requirements. Maybe that was self-evident. But anyway, I'm going to talk about each of these filings. There's a 2017 update that comes a year after the 2016, and then, of course, the final one is due in 2018. I've asterisked the two, the 2016 and the 2018, and if you read closely, EPA talks about the failure to file that initial submission as a trigger for a federal plan, and also, of course, not filing a final plan would be a trigger for a federal plan. but they don't say that about 2017 update. And a follow-up question to EPA suggested that no, in fact, the 2017 update does not trigger a federal plan. I'm not sure whether that makes a difference, but it's good to know. So the initial state submission, it's a request for extension for the most part, and an explanation of why it's needed. So here it would be needed to get legislation, and the session didn't end until May or June, or that they didn't meet this year at all in the case of some states. But just an explanation of why the extension is needed, and we've heard Joe Goffman say at EPA that they're expecting that for the most part states are going to have good reasons, and that's why they set up a process where EPA is going to get a 90-day review period to look at the extension, and then if they don't ask for more information or say it's not sufficient, then it's deemed granted. There's not going to be a huge exercise here for getting the extension, which I think is what a lot of states and stakeholders ask for. Interestingly, a year from now, the state needs to identify the approaches it has under consideration. It does not yet have to say, I chose rate-based trading ready or I chose mass-based trading ready. It can say, I'm still thinking about mass or rate. And it's between these two or these three approaches. Another thing that has to be in there is a description of what the state has done to provide an opportunity for public comment on their request for a state extension. And the EPA uses the term meaningful engagement with stakeholders, including vulnerable communities, the term that they use. So there are, between now and next September, requirements that states reach out to stakeholders, essentially have some stakeholder outreach that they can point to. They also need to point out what they're going to be doing going forward in the nature of stakeholder engagement. And here is also a time where the state says, yeah, I'm interested in the Clean Energy Incentive Program, or no, I'm not interested. It's not a binding declaration of intent, and so most states will probably say, yeah, I'm keeping this option open. I'm still thinking about whether to do the CEIP, I'm interested. And the EPA wants to know because it affects the number of allowances and or rate-based credits that they're going to sort of have to keep in their matching fund. So there isn't a whole lot in that initial submission. It's sort of a touching base, mostly an explanation why you need the extension. The 2017 update, however, is a bit more. By then, EPA is expecting the state to commit to a plan approach and give a summary of the status of all the activities that lead to the implementation of that approach. And here they're expecting a comprehensive roadmap with a schedule and milestones for completing the plan. And as I mentioned, it seems like there's no federal trigger for this one, or that's what I was told, and it wasn't an official proclamation. But my sense is that there's no federal trigger here. So I think this is a nudge and an encouragement for states to have these things in place by then. And honestly, anyone who's going to have a final plan done by September 18 probably will know all of these things. So maybe it's not a huge worry in terms of whether there's a federal trigger or not. So then the final plan requirements. So EPA did clarify some of the questions that were coming under the proposal, such as, do I need to have the legislation in place? Do I need to demonstrate funding to implement the program? Or do I need to have the rulemaking completed? The answer to all of those is yes. Although I will note that EPA has changed the rules for under 40 CFR Part 60, the subpart that deals with, I think it's the Part A, that deals with these 111D plans, and I can get you the site. Anyway, they've changed those rules to allow it to give conditional approvals and partial approvals to state plans. And so, if when the final plan is filed, there are things that are not in there, then EPA seems to be putting itself in a position just like it is in a normal state implementation plan context, where it can say, all of this stuff looks good. We think you need to change that other thing. And so there's be some likelihood that there will be some of that conditional approval or approval conditioned on some subsequent shifting of things in the plan. So we're going to put together a more specific set of bullets on the process and the contents of these things, and we'll have those for our next meeting. But it's all written out in there, and what needs to be in there, the kinds of summaries and descriptions and showings that the state has to put in the final plan. One thing we can say, and this was evident on the graphic that I've used, that was EPA's graphic, there are more hoops to jump through when the further you kind of divert from the model rules. The model rules are essentially presumptively approvable, and when you have variations and you have things like the state measures approach, there are different demonstrations and projections that you have to throw in there. And if you're a glutton for punishment, one way you can convince yourself of that is to walk through the rule language and actually have an approach in mind. And I'll say to yourself, I'm going to do mass-based trading covering new sources, and then answer the question, what do I need to do with each step in the final plan process? And you'll see that it's much less for that simplified type approach than it is for when you get creative and different. So that's the general concept I want to leave you with on this, subject to really exploring the rest of the detail that we'll circulate it, and it's certainly in the rule. So that brings me to the end. Patrice, how do we unmute people?